Welcome to AI for Good, the leading action-oriented global and inclusive United Nations platform on AI. Organized by ITU in partnership with 40 UN sister organizations and co-convened with Switzerland. The goal of AI for Good is to identify practical applications of AI to advance the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and scale those solutions for global impact. In today's session, we're counting on you to use the live video wall feature to ask questions and post comments to help create an engaging discussion. We encourage you to stay until the end, as we will hold a 30-minute networking session in the neural network. Here you can meet, ask questions to our distinguished speakers, connect, and chat with the AI for Good community. It is now time to kick off the session and welcome our first speaker. The floor is yours.
Hi, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to this AI for Good session on how AI beat the world's best human esports racers with Sony AI America. My name's Bryn Balcom. I'm the chair of the ITU focus group on AI for autonomous and assisted driving. I work as a autonomy systems and regulatory expert at a UK autonomy company called Oxbotica, and previously was the Chief Technology Officer and Chief Strategy Officer of RoboRace, the world's first fully autonomous physical motor racing series. So I have a particular passion for this topic, and it's my great pleasure and honor to introduce you to Pete Werman, who is the director of Sony AI America, who will talk about the challenge that they launched and how GT Sophy came to be, and how it ended up beating the best human esports racers. Over to you, Pete.
Thank you, Bryn. Let me start sharing my screen. Okay, can you see the screen all right?
Perfect.
Okay. Well, thank you. I'm very excited to be here today to get to describe our project to you. And the paper that we wrote about it afterwards. As Bryn said, I am the director of Sony AI America. I was also the project lead on our game AI project to develop an agent that could race in the game Gran Turismo. Sony AI is a relatively new organization. It was established in April of 2020. We have offices in Tokyo and Zurich, and we have a distributed workforce across North America. If you want to learn more, you can check out our website at ai.sony. Whoops. This project itself was a partnership between Sony AI, Polyphony Digital, who are the game developers behind Gran Turismo, and Sony Interactive Entertainment, which is of course, the group that makes PlayStations and under which many of our game studios exist. In this case, they provided access to a large number of PlayStations in the cloud through the PlayStation Now network, on which we were able to do the training for the agent. Gran Turismo is a very high fidelity racing simulation game that runs on PlayStations. It includes quite extensive physics models, includes things like slipstream effects, tire slip, the impact of aerodynamics on downforce and traction, and quite a bit more. There's a robust esports community around this game, and it's even used by professional drivers for training, and it was recently the platform on which the virtual Olympics was held. What we set out to do was try to learn to race at the level of the best human drivers in the world in this game. This is a little clip from one of the yearly Nations Cup competitions that Polyphony holds, and you can see the high skill level of the drivers involved and the realism of the racing environment. What we wanted to do was to compete and beat players at this skill level. So we set up a competition between our agent and 4 of the top esports drivers in the world. Because of the pandemic, we were limited to drivers in Japan, but this did include some of the best, some of the most recent world champions. We have Takuma Miyazono here on the left side, then Tomoaki Yamanaka, Ryoto Kokubun, and Shotaro Ryu were the 4 human competitors. We picked 4 racetracks: Dragon Trail Seaside on the left, Lago Maggiore, and then the Cirque de l'Isart, which is the location of the 24 Hours of Le Mans race. And on each of those tracks, we used a different car in the race. A Mercedes in the first race, a Porsche 911 in the second race, and then a very high-end Formula One light car designed with Red Bull in the final race. So each of these provided a kind of different challenge. The courses are all different and the style of cars are different, varying from a very high-end road car to a middle-tier racing car to a high-end racing car. And each race was set up so that we had 4 instances of Gran Turismo Sophy and 4 human drivers in the race. We raced twice. Originally, we planned to race once, targeted for July 2nd. And in that race, we were competitive, but we didn't quite win the overall team score. So the scoring was based upon final positions, with 10 points going to the car in first place, then 8, 6, 5, we're down to 1. And the last race on Cirque de l'Isart counted twice. So you can see here, we lost by a small amount in the first race, won by a little bit more in the second race, but then lost the third race and ended up in the team score down 86-70. So we went back to the drawing board, examined what worked well and what didn't, came back in October with a rematch. And in that second race, GT Sophy won handily. You can see we had twice as many points overall as the 4 human drivers. So what I'm going to do is describe, giving away the end of the story, but I'm going to describe now how we accomplished this and show evidence for the skill that GT Sophy developed over the course of this project. If you want to read more about the project, there's an article in the February 10th version of Nature in which we describe the project in great detail. First, we have a little video that gives a kind of exciting overview.
There's very few places where you can go out and say, I'm going to build an AI and I'm going to make it truly superhuman.
We're going to create artificial intelligence that will unleash the power of the human creativity and imagination.
Gran Turismo Sophy is a super exciting project. It's an amazing AI research and development activity.
There are many racing games where the physics is half done, but in Gran Turismo, that racing sensation that the players get, that's really at the core of the game.
このなんか車文化、車という存在をもう丸ごとビデオゲームの中にこう再現したいなと思ったんですね。
Because of the realism of the game, it is actually very difficult to program agents.
We spent a lot of time trying to figure out what things we needed to change in order to get that superhuman performance.
Why are we building this GT Sophy agent?
This is not just a technical breakthrough project. It really is about bringing AI into the hands of the game developers who are going to build the new experiences for the players.
本当にすごいアグレッシブで、これからもっと一緒にレースしていきたいなっていうふうに思いましたね。
Okay, there's a slightly longer version of that movie with more information if you'd like to watch it. But that gives you a sense for the kind of environment in which the racing occurs and some of the people involved in the project. So let me tell you more about how we trained GT Sophy. First, we used a technique called reinforcement learning. This is kind of a classic picture of the reinforcement learning loop. We have an agent that's operating in the world. It takes actions. Something happens in the environment. In response to those actions, the agent can observe the new state that occurs, its new position and speed, etc. It also may get a reward or a penalty based upon those state changes. And then the agent participates in this loop over and over. It collects experience and uses that experience to improve its performance over time. In the machine learning landscape, you can think of it like this. Reinforcement learning is a field in and of itself. There's obviously a large field around research into neural networks. The combination of them is this more recent field we call deep reinforcement learning. And then our project in particular is within a subset of that space of problems you could apply deep reinforcement learning to, in which we have continuous time, continuous actions, and continuous states. And those kind of conditions drive many of our design choices. In particular, we looked at the problem of learning to race as having these three major areas of work. First, we needed to learn how to control the car and operate it at the very edge of its performance in order to get the best possible times. Then we needed to learn how to race, which is, of course, driving around other cars and learning to pass, use the slipstream, learning to block to the extent allowed by the rules of the game, etc. And then finally, we also had to learn how to do this in a way that conformed to the etiquette of racing. I'll go into all of these in a little bit more detail now. First, in the space of race car control, I'll describe the features and actions and rewards that our agent gets for all of these things. The actions the agent can take there's really only two dimensions. It can throttle or brake, doesn't do both simultaneously. And it can turn left to right. Both of these dimensions are mapped into this range of -1 to 1. It gets rewards for a variety of things. One of the most important ones is the incremental progress it's making along the course. So if you imagine the car is in this position and we project it to the center line, the next time step it's in this position, we measure the distance between the two projections to the center line, and based upon how much progress it's made, it gets a reward proportional to that. But it gets penalties for certain other attributes. If it goes off course, if two or more of its tires are out of bounds, it gets a penalty. If it hits a wall, it gets a penalty, or if its tires slip, it gets a penalty. What does the agent actually get to see? Well, it knows its XYZ velocities, accelerations, and angular accelerations. It knows the load on all of its tires and the angles of those tires with respect to the direction it's traveling, so it knows if it's slipping or not. And it knows, in addition to knowing where it is overall along the course, it has a view of the section of the course that's coming up in front of it, that's pictured over here on the right side. Basically, we look at the boundaries of the course for the next 6 seconds based upon the car's current travel speed. And the set of points indicated by these darker black dots are the information that's fed into the neural network about what's coming up. We also explored a variety of different algorithms. In the end, we came up with an enhancement to a soft actor critic algorithm that we call quantile regression soft actor critic. I won't go into this in a lot of detail, but basically this version of a soft actor critic algorithm learns to predict the distribution of future rewards. And then it uses that information when making decisions about what to do. It also uses an n-step return. So rather than the kind of classic one-step return, it looks ahead. It uses information from several steps forward when constructing its reward function. And this seemed to stabilize the backup process. And these things turned out to be important. If you look over here, our lap time when we added the quantile regression is 0.6 of a second faster, which is basically the difference between just about as good as the best humans or being better than the best humans on this particular course. Looking farther ahead, increasing the number of steps that we used in the reward computation helped quite a bit. We had originally in July ran with an n equal 5, but after doing more ablations on this, we ended up increasing that to 7, and you can see that increase took another 1/10 of a second off of the performance. How do we know that we're better than the best humans? Well, it turns out every once in a while, Polyphony will run these online competitions with Gran Turismo Sport, and people will try to get the best possible lap time they can get on any particular course. So this picture shows the distribution of all the humans who tried this challenge on Lake Maggiore with the Porsche 911. And you can see a few of them were down in the 1:15-second range. Kind of the mean player's best ever individual lap time was about 120 seconds. And it tails off to players more like me way up here. Superimposed on this, we put down how long it takes Gran Turismo Sophy to learn to get that kind of lap time on this course. In about 4 hours, starting from scratch, the agent has learned how to traverse the course and can get around the course in about 150 seconds. In 8 hours, it's in the top, it's in the bottom 10% or so of all players. Within 24 hours, it's moved to the top 5% or so of all players. And then over the next, it takes another, say, 10 days to get to its, to converge. And at that point, it's as best or better than the best human players who've recorded times in this challenge. This particular graph shows the top 5 human players as circles and their best times. And the orange histogram inside of it shows 100 samples of Gran Turismo Sophy driving that car around that track. And in this particular case on Lake Maggiore, there was one human that was kind of whose best individual time was as good as GT Sophy's mean time. But in the other 2 courses and car combinations, so GT Sophy's times were, for all 100 samples, were better than the best humans. It turned out this driver was the winner of the FIA Virtual Olympics and was the only person who had a chance to play against Gran Turismo Sophy in the previous time trial event. So he had a little advantage and knew that this kind of a time was possible when he was practicing. What does the skill level of the agent look like? I think this little clip shows how good the agent is at driving. This is a clip from Dragon Trail Seaside, and it's entering a section of the course called the Chicane of Death, where there's these 2 sharp turns across curbs with walls on either side. And you can see the car is able to just barely miss the walls and keep a very high speed through the whole section. We've also looked at what is it that allows GT Sophy to get a better lap time. And it can be very hard to discern exactly what the agent's doing differently. In this case, we took a look at how GT Sophy drove on Cirque du Sarthe and compared it to one of the other professional drivers, not one from the event, but not one from the race, head-to-head racing, but one in our time trial comparisons. His name is Igor Fraga. He's actually another one of the world champions from recent years, and has been recruited out of the Gran Turismo Esports League to drive real race cars. If you look here, each of these colored vertical bars corresponds to a section of the track. And you notice we highlight them because in each of those sections, you can see that, first off, this graph is how far behind the ghost of Gran Turismo Sophy is Igor Fraga. And so you can see the black line shows that he is getting slowly farther and farther behind over the length of the course. And the biggest steps occur in these particular corners through these chicanes on the backside. This corner at the bottom is the yellow one. And this series of corners called the Indianapolis curve, and then this final chicane. We examined this particular corner a little more closely, and we looked at what the actions are, comparing Igor's actions versus GT Sophy's. One thing you notice is GT Sophy operates at 10 hertz, so it makes 10 decisions per second. That means it's a little bit more of a jerky motion because it's not operating as frequently. The human drivers have steering wheels and brake pedals, so they can operate more smoothly. But you do see, if you look at this yellow area, it looks like Igor goes into the corner a little faster. He actually picks up a little bit of time on the agent, but then cannot accelerate out of it as fast. And for that reason, overall, he falls behind. On each one of these corners, they tend to show the same pattern. I won't go through all the rest of the graphs there, but here's what it's like from Igor's point of view. You can see the ghost of GT Sophy ahead of him, and he's trying to follow that agent. And you can...
Man, that's fast. That's really fast. Like, I really want to watch the onboard as well to see how like they throttle and you know, braking trace, steering trace as well. It work, because it's definitely something else.
So you can hear how impressed he is trying to keep up with the agent and exactly how it's able to take that corner at a pace that increases its lead by a tenth of a second or so. But of course, being faster isn't enough. Racing, of course, involves interacting with other cars. So how did we represent those cars to the agent? In the end, we tried a lot of different things. In the end, we ended up with a fairly simple representation. The agent maintains two lists of the cars around it, one of the cars in front and one of the cars behind. And it keeps track of the relative position and velocity and acceleration of all of those cars. We also had to encourage the agent to actually try to pass these cars nearby. Otherwise, it would just be happy to follow them at as high a speed as possible. So in addition to the rewards that we talked about before, the agent gets another reward component if it either closes the gap with the car in front of it or increases its lead over a car behind it within this range of nearby cars. And this is a symmetric term, so that if another car is closing the gap with our agent, then the agent is experiencing a penalty or a negative reward. Now, finally, one of the things that sets this challenge apart from other recent major AI milestones is that it has this very subtle and imprecise form of sportsmanship. And if you look at the rules, this little clip here is the rules from the FIA guidelines, the rule book, and it describes why human judges called stewards might be looking at incidents on the courses and handing out penalties. And you see it's has phrases like an agent could, a driver could get penalized if they caused an avoidable collision, if they illegitimately prevented a legitimate overtaking maneuver. All of these things are very subjective. And oftentimes the stewards will look at the context of the incident, the outcome of the incident, did it affect anybody, and make these judgments. And sometimes seconds or minutes later, they might actually hand out the penalties when they make the determinations. There isn't anything in the game that has kind of high level accurate human quality judging. And so this what became a very challenging thing for us to build into the reinforcement learning framework. How to capture this subtle etiquette when there was no ground truth process for us to make these determinations. What we did was experiment with a lot of different things again. In the final races, we had several small collision penalties that would be applied based on the circumstances. First, basically, anytime the agent and another car bumped, there was some kind of a penalty, regardless of who was at fault. If our agent was actually at fault and hit the other car in the rear, then it would get an extra collision penalty. And then we found that the very high speed and complex Surf track with these particular race cars, we needed to add a few other components. And so we added a sideswipe penalty if two cars bumped on straightaways. If our car hit another car in the rear on a straightaway, we added another penalty, an extra penalty on top of this one. And if our car bumped another car when it was in a corner and it was not clearly the other car's fault by rear-ending us, then we got another component, another penalty component. And these are really important. If you watch this, this is an example where the agent didn't have a well-tuned reward collision penalty, and you can see it punted that blue car off the road. That's not allowed in the game. And if you do too much of that, you can get thrown out of the race entirely. On the other hand, if we didn't get it right, then you see situations like this. This is a really interesting clip because you can see our car, which is Sophy Orange, being trailed by Yamanaka. You can see it kind of trying to break the slipstream a little. And then suddenly Yamanaka zooms by our car. When we looked, this was not a behavior that we wanted. We didn't expect him to be able to pass us in that situation. When we looked at it after the race, this was an event from our July competition, we noticed that our car actually moved over a little and slowed down a tiny bit. And our intuition was that GT Sophy felt like the car behind it was coming up too fast and it was going to get hit, and so it moved out of the way. But in reality, it had it had the inside position here, and it didn't need to move out of the way. It should have been able to hold its line and force Yamanaka to try to pass on the outside. So one thing we found was it was really important that we expose the agent to the kinds of critical racing situations that happen in a race, but don't happen very often. But when they do happen, you really have to take advantage of them and do the right thing. So to accomplish that, we came up with a fairly complex training regimen. First, we would often, one of the nice things about this the setup was that we could actually control up to 20 cars on the track. So sometimes we would control all of the cars as our training agent and spread them equally spaced around the track. This was really useful when learning to just drive around the track in a time trial scenario. Sometimes we would control 10 cars and have one opponent car nearby. So we had lots of experience in 1v1 situations, or we had two opponents and have 1v2 situations, 1v3, or just two clusters where we had one agent in a tight group of 7 cars. And in all of these cases, the positions and the initial arrangement of the cars were randomized to create lots of variety in the situations. We also focused on parts of the course where critical events might happen, and we wanted to make sure things went, the agent was prepared for them. So here, the grid start at Sarth was very important and very tricky. Those first couple curves are very sharp, and there's a crowd of 8 cars around. Very easy for collisions to happen there. Slipstream passing on this course, in particular with this car, was crucial. So made sure our agent was well prepared for that. And then this, at the very end, right before the starting line, there's this very sharp set of chicanes. And that was also very important to get right. We did similar things for the other 2 tracks with different kinds of scenarios called out as critical for those racetracks with those cars. When done right, the agent learns some pretty impressive skills. So here's a situation, again, coming to that same corner 20 at the bottom, this time in an actual race situation. And you can see GT Sophy kind of fakes to the outside, and then when the human moves to block, the agent moves back to the inside and takes the inside line on that corner, ends up accomplishing a very impressive pass there. These things made a real difference. When we raced, we would often take an agent and put it in a 4 versus 4 scenario against another agent and measure the team scores as a kind of a simulation for what was going to happen when racing the humans. And if we didn't include all of the variations that we came up with and all of the opponent types, we basically didn't do as well as our best agent. But when we did include all of the training, all of the proper training opponents and scenarios, then our agent was able to basically come out with half the points. 19.5 would be a tie. It was also really important what kinds of opponents we let the agent train against. When we, this graph shows the team score again. So if you're as good as your opponent, you expect to be about here. If you're on the vertical axis, we have a measure we call questionable collisions, which gives an indication of how aggressive the agent is. Being high on this is bad. When we train the agent only against the built-in AI, which is okay, but not nearly as fast as our agent, and our agent learns to be overconfident and is too aggressive. When we used agents that we had trained that we thought were too overly aggressive themselves and let our agent train against those opponents, then our agent became kind of too timid and would back off of confrontations more and ended up with a much lower team score. So we were trying to find something that had a small number of questionable collisions and could get a good team score. One of the other things that turned out to be quite tricky was determining which policy to use in a particular race. One of the challenges was we could test and race against our own agents quite a bit and against the built-in AI, which was much slower than GT Sophy. We had very limited ability to test against human drivers. In particular, there are very few human drivers who are on the same level of skill as the agent. And you just don't have access to that kind of an evaluation. And the human drivers will do things that are slightly differently than the agent. So practicing against the agent isn't necessarily preparing you for driving against human drivers who might brake a little earlier or take a slightly different line through a corner. So it's really important to try to approximate that as best as possible. So what we did was we would train several agents all on the same scenario. We'd pick from each of those training runs, we'd pick the best candidate policies. They may be at the end, they may not be. We often saw skills kind of come and go through the training process. So it wasn't necessarily that the policy completely converged to something that was good at all skills at all times. So we'd filter those out into a smaller set of policies. We'd run through a battery of tests we called the Anathlon, and pick the best of all of those candidates from all of those runs. We'd pick a much smaller group of best policies. Then we'd race them against each other in this 4 versus 4 player versus player scenario, score them all. Based upon how they scored against each other, we ordered them, and then we took the best couple policies and actually ran them against a couple test human drivers at Polyphony who volunteered for this task, from which we picked the one we were going to enter into a race. When this is done well, you get an agent that respects the sportsmanship of the game, is highly competitive, and looks like a real human driver in that same video that we showed earlier. This gray car is a GT Sophy car, the white car is Yamanaka, and you can see that they have this extended wheel-to-wheel challenge through the last part of Lake Maggiore, where it's just like exactly the kind of competition that you hope to see. Inevitably, of course, the question of whether this is a fair comparison comes up. It's a tricky question. My answer to that is that there are some ways in which the humans have advantages in this situation, and there's some ways in which the agent has advantages. I won't go through all this, but the short version of it is, excuse me, GT Sophy has less information, but more precise information than the humans have. And the humans have more continuous control, but less precise information. And so it's, it's arguable. Our goal wasn't really to do a, put them on the same, try to create the same set of inputs for both of them. It was to find out if we could create an AI that was as good as the best humans, and to do it in a way that was compatible with how you would then add this to the game at a later point in time. You wouldn't use vision if you were adding this into the game because you can't generate the vision for all of the agents that would be driving. So let me give you a few highlights from the race, just to show that GT Sophy has learned real racing skills. This is from the October race, the rematch. In the first version of this on Dragon Trail Seaside in the July race, we didn't do very well in the first series of turns, and the humans got out in front. And at that point, this was a 4-lap race, and there was no easy way for the agents to catch up. This is the start of that October version of that race.
Followed by Cockerman and Violette. They're all darting into the slipstream to try and get a run on their fellow competitor. Only Bordeaux does not have the advantage then of that slipstream. Into the braking zone of turn 2 we go. It's a lunge from Cockerman as he tries to go up the inside, but it's actually Sophie Violette who goes on the outside into turn 2. Very aggressive driving then from Violette, and up into second position at the end of the first corner. So it's now the 2 GT AIs that are in.
So you can see how crowded the start is, how tricky that corner is. And yet Violette is able to find an outside move on the first corner that gives it the inside of the, well, actually on the outside of the second corner, that gives it the inside of the third corner, and make a clean pass at the very beginning of the race. Those 2 agents went on to place first and second in the race. They had like a 5-second lead by the end. This is an example showing also later in the same race.
Could an opportunity present itself then here for Ver? Well, going defensive then
Actually,
is Yamanaka.
just,
Ver goes towards the outside.
later on the first lap
This is
of the
getting
same
pretty
race.
close between them as they run side by side into turn 17. Yamanaka holds firm into the inside line, and Ver is not able to get themselves past them.
These cars are in 4th, 5th, and 6th.
For the time being. So, over the timeline we go. This is where the slipstream, though, of course, will help Sophie there as they come down towards turn 1 and then into the braking zone of turn 2. You can see the lift off the throttle there for Vera. Just don't want to get too close behind coming through those series of corners. Big old bit of opposite lock as we come down the inside. Miyazono's trying to go through there as well, but not close enough. Vera goes through on Tomoaki Yamanaka, though, for P4. So aggressive and robust driving from the AI then as they move themselves up a position.
So you see there, same corner now with a smaller number of cars and a different move by the same policy that is being used for all the cars. You also see one thing that's interesting to note if you're not familiar with race car driving, when two cars are following each other that closely, when one's following the other that closely, the aerodynamics on the second car mean that it has to drive slightly differently than the car in front. And that's why the announcer mentioned that Verde had to lift off the gas a little because in the slipstream of the car in front, it's seeing slightly different dynamics from its own car. This is another example where you can see the variety of skills that GT Sophy is able to apply. This was actually from the July event, but it shows such a clean example of the variety of paths that the agent has learned to take through a corner that we like to show it. So in this is one of the corners at Maggiore. The red line is the path that GT Sophy would take if it was all alone going through that corner. So a few seconds earlier, the red car had gone through here and it was all by itself. So it took this particular path. You can see it does the classic start wide, hit the apex, and then finish wide through the whole corner. In this case, the green line and the gray lines are GT Sophy cars. You'll see them in the video in a second. And the blue and yellow lines are Kokuban and Miyazono in particular. And what's interesting to see from all of these different paths, in this video, you're going to see both green and gray paths, both yellow and blue in the same corner. You can see the humans followed basically the same line. They tried to protect the inside. Because of that, they kind of went deep through the corner and came out here, while both green and gray are able to take they take a different, but they're both able to get out inside of the humans and they end up in front by the end of this video. You see green actually gives up a position coming down the hill here. But then they both manage to take that corner much sharper and get a better exit and end up coming up the hill ahead of the humans. And that shows that even the same policy is being run on all these cars, the red one, which isn't in the video, and the green and gray. It's still very flexible to the conditions under which it's going through that corner. Now, finally, we'll go back to that same section of track where we saw Sophy Orange give way to Yamanaka in the July race. After tweaking a variety of things between July and October and improving the training process, we'll see the same situation happen, surprisingly, again, in the same section of track. So here, in this case, Orange is behind Yamanaka. You can see how it intentionally follows that car, his car, as he kind of weaves back and forth. And then it moves to the inside and holds its own line. It doesn't give way the way it did in the July race, and is able then to beat him to the corner. And from this point on, this car ends up winning the race. Okay. And then finally, overall, I gave you the final scores earlier, but here's more of a breakdown and a more detailed look at how the races unfolded. In the first two races, Seaside and Maggiore, GT Sophy placed first, second, fourth, and fifth overall. And these graphs are again how far behind each car is from the leader of the race. You can see these two GT Sophy cars in front. Once they made that pass at the very beginning of the race that we saw earlier on Seaside, they drove tail to hood all the way through the course without any incidents. The humans, you see, tend to slowly fall behind, whereas the other AI cars, when they're a certain distance behind the leader, since of course they're running the same policy, when they're driving alone, they are steady as a rock. These step functions you see are tend to be penalties or collisions or someone lost control. There's a few in all races. Someone might get penalized for exceeding the course boundary, or for bumping another car, as I mentioned. The third race, Sarth, was a much noisier race. It's a much harder course. There were more penalties, both for humans and the AI. And interestingly, in this one, that Sophy orange car that we just saw got bumped off the road in the very first corner and was like 9 seconds behind the leaders when it got back on course. And that car actually came back and won the race. Finally, I have a few testimonials. Yamanaka said that it feels like driving against humans, which is exactly what our goal was. And it's interesting to note that drivers at this level don't have easy ways to practice in really competitive race situations. The game's current built-in AI is not good enough to to give them a challenge. And there's only a handful of people across the world who are as good as they are at the game and can provide a challenging situation. They tend to practice a lot by just learning the ideal lines by following ghosts, which is what Valerio Gallo, who was the virtual Olympics champion and the person who had that particularly outstanding time on Lake Lago Maggiore. He was impressed by how fast chasing the GT Sophy Ghost was, how fast the GT Sophy Ghost was when he was chasing it. And this quote actually came before the data point that I showed you earlier. So it's possible that that helped him achieve his limits. Emily Jones was another racer who participated in the time trial analysis. She got to race against the ghost of GT Sophy on Seaside. And I'll play her video.
It was really interesting seeing the lines where the AI would go. So there were certain corners that I was going out wide and then cutting back in, and the AI was going like in the whole way around. So I learned a lot about the lines and also knowing what to prioritize. Like the AI into turn 1, for example, I was braking later than the AI, but the AI would get a much better exit than me and beat me to the next corner. So I didn't notice that until I saw the AI and I was like, oh, okay, cool. I should do that instead.
And this gets at the idea that having trained an agent that's as good as this is at the game, we might learn a little bit about how to become better drivers. So what's next for our team? We are starting to discuss with Polyphony Digital ways that GT Sophy could be incorporated into the game. There's a lot of interesting computational questions and interesting questions about how you make it fun for everybody, not just the best players in the world. There's also a lot of things that we did not address yet with the agent. It doesn't know anything about tire wear, doesn't know how to take pit stops. It doesn't really know how to deal with opponents or itself when it gets a penalty. We haven't trained it for different weather conditions or anything like that yet. And there's no strategic decision-making going on. This agent is a very, very reactive agent. It has no history and no planning, but it's really tactically very efficient. But there's certainly room to explore research into how to add this strategic decision-making into the agent. We'd also like to study how you can explain what GT Sophy has learned to do so that we can more easily learn from the kinds of behaviors that it's discovered. And that's it for the formal part of the presentation.
Excellent. Hey, at this point, if we were in a physical room, I'll be asking for a round of applause because that was a fantastic presentation. So we'll have to do that virtually, and I'll do that for everybody that we have online listening. But a really, really fascinating presentation. Pete, just to ask one question: did you race against the AI?
I have tested one of the scaled down versions.
Yeah.
And yeah, it was great. It was really fun to race against. But yeah, I can't race against the particular version you saw here. I'll see it at the beginning and then not until it laps me.
Excellent. We have a couple of questions from the floor. So a good friend of mine, Fred Werner, has posted a question here, and it's a little bit forward looking, really, Pete. So it's could this technology be used in real cars? So I'm assuming real race cars, as an AI coach for those human drivers. So a little bit like being able to help them decide optimal racing lines, braking zones, techniques like slowing and fast out on corners. So could you see this in future? I suppose first question is, could you see that in the game first? And is that one of the things that Sony could be interested in, is using it as a training instructor, an AI coach? And then what would be the challenges in bringing that into the physical world after that?
The short answer is yes, that is something that's possible and would be interesting to investigate. It's in the game, it would be easier, but there's still this question of how do you take what the agent thinks you should have done and convert it to something that you can understand and can act on and then learn from. There's still a gap in our ability to explain the agent's recommendations to you. Then moving it to doing that kind of thing in the real world, there's a thing we call the sim to real gap, which is the difference between any system that you simulate and what will really happen in the real world, in the actual physical system you're simulating. We're getting better at closing that gap, but it really depends a lot on how good your simulation is and how good your model is and the environment itself. So with enough data from the real world, you might be able to close that gap and make it a useful coach even for real drivers.
Yeah, okay. And interestingly, in Rover Racer, we were doing physical racing. And so one of the tools we used to improve the quality of data that the AI drivers were getting was vehicle-to-vehicle communication. So using that, we were able to share exact knowledge of where the vehicle was located and also its speeds and its acceleration. So as close to the type of data you would extract from the gaming engine, as far as I read from your paper.
Yeah, I think although we didn't use vision or LiDAR or any of the more realistic sensing inputs, I think in many of the cases, if you were designing a physical version of this kind of thing, you would take those inputs and you'd convert them to the kind of data that we then fed into the agent. The positions and velocities and accelerations of the other cars, some encoding of what that course looks like, whether you can see it or not. You know what the course looks like, so you know over the hill you're going to turn to the left. So that information would be made available to your car. There's of course actual uncertainty in the real world about sensor data that we don't have to deal with, but yeah, the format would be similar.
Yeah, and following up from that, we had a question from Rob Akers, which I think is looking at something similar, but that sort of the differences between the human and the AI in terms of access to data. And I think he was making the point that yes, that as you pointed out, the AI has accurate information that's coming through about those accelerations, where the human and speeds of other vehicles and their location, whereas the human would have to infer that from their senses, from their eyes. And so they're having to look forward, they can't look backwards at the same time. So that information isn't available to them. So they can't have this, yes, they might have two lists, but they can only update one at a time, basically.
That's right. Yeah, it's definitely a challenge to make claims about the fairness, like completely equal comparisons. I think that they're different enough that as long as it seems fair to the players, that's kind of close enough, I guess. Like the agent actually has no memory, so it has to construct that list every time from the sensors. But a human would remember there's a car behind them, even if they haven't looked in the rearview
Yeah, I think that's actually one of the really interesting human skills that we kind of overlook. So even in on-road driving, looking at autonomous vehicles in on-road, we often talk about, oh, the vehicle has 360-degree perception all the time from its array of sensors, and so it can see exactly what's going on at any moment. The sort of human vision limitation of only being able to see forward at one moment in time actually means that we've become very good at doing predictive behavior and modeling of things motion even without looking at them. So we're able to pull up at a junction, look to the right, see the vehicles come in, make an assessment on its speed and trajectory, and then not look at it again, and then be able to make a driving decision. And I think that predictive capability is now, you know, the next phase really of AI development for driving in racing and for on road.
Yeah, that's right. And it's kind of surprising that we were able to develop an agent as good as this one is without any of, like, no planning, no memory, none of the things you might have thought you would need.
Yeah, and I was it was interesting when you start to talk about the strategy, because I think you said at the moment the model's looking 6 seconds ahead.
Well, it's not like looking, it sees what the shape of the course is for about 6 seconds of travel, but it's not looking ahead. It's not planning through 6 seconds or anything like that. It just needs to know what the curves look like in front of it.
And I think the example you were giving was a little bit like the slipstreaming, in that strategically it might be better not to overtake at the beginning of a long straight, because otherwise the other car will be able to draft you down the remainder of the straight and then overtake into the next corner. And that moves away from almost tactics and then into strategy, because it's slightly longer term planning than just the reactive planning. Is that correct?
That's right, exactly. Or waiting to the end of the race to make your move. Yeah, there's a lot of strategy that goes on in racing that this agent doesn't have yet.
I find that topic, I think, really interesting and really challenging. So I don't know if we have any more questions from the floor, but please keep them coming in through the neural network. I think that would be great. Just going back to the penalties and the mechanism of penalties, because you mentioned that they were human stewards would normally do that, obviously in a normal FIA officiated race. I'm assuming the same human-based stewarding is done in the esports domain.
Exactly.
And therefore, when you were racing AI versus human, it was also humans making those subjective assessments.
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah. And that's one of the reasons why it was then very difficult to interpret what those humans would decide during that specific race. There was no model inside the software that you could use to apply those penalties or learn those penalties and learn what was reasonable or not.
That's right. Within the while training, we had no access to that kind of information. And the more we tried to accurately estimate what stewards would do, the more aggressive the agent became. So we ended up backing off of trying to reproduce it to this more conservative approach.
I mean, it's a fascinating and quite topical discussion given what happened in Formula One last year, where it felt like the whole championship was coming down to stewarding decisions and whether it was acceptable for the drivers, particularly Max and Lewis, to be driving in the way that they were, and whether they were pushing those boundaries too far. So it definitely is an unsolved problem. But it's interesting that, but it's interesting the sort of subjective interpretation and the sort of, you refer to it as racing etiquette as well, and the sort of the way the rules are fairly softly written about reasonable behavior, because we're facing something similar on the roads as we're introducing autonomous vehicles. There is a perception from those humans that the AI systems will behave as the general population, and when they don't, that can cause conflict. So I don't know if you could speak to that a little bit more, because it's a really difficult research challenge at the moment.
Yeah, all I can say is it is a very hard problem. It will in the work we did, of course, we get to assume a closed course, and the only things that we have to worry about that are moving besides our car are the other cars. But in real driving scenarios, there's just a very long tail of scenarios that you have to be able to handle well. And it's pretty challenging.
And I think the that ability for you to have, so you had the mapping in some way encoded into the and presented to the AI as it was learning, and that's one of the things that we noticed within motorsport. Not knowledge of that map is really important, because if you just drive to the limits of your vision, you would be incredible, and then the need to stop in case there isn't something beyond your field of vision, then you would drive incredibly slowly around many of the corners. So that predictive capability of the track is clear, therefore I can continue to drive fast was kind of given in a little bit of map information, I take it.
Yeah, GT Sophy had a map of each track that we changed it on, and we would use that map to then compute those points that I showed in that earlier video. Oops, not that one. Same corner though.
Yeah.
So this, oops, let me get rid of all this extra stuff. So the agent had a static map of the whole course, but the policy, the decision-making neural network would only get these black dots as it was driving. And it was a fixed number of points mapped to fixed inputs on the neural network. And we computed what inputs to give to that layer from the course map and the velocity of the car.
And did you experiment with that length, Pete? What did you find? Because you settled on 6 seconds, but did you try shorter and longer? And what were the effects of that?
I don't think we did a very we didn't try 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. We tried a couple values. Less than 6 was not quite enough to see around a sequence of curves to know whether you should be taking it left or right edges of this particular corner.
Okay.
So, and more than that, increased the network size because it created more inputs. So it's just kind of through experimentation we came up with this number of points and a range over which they extended in time.
And I saw in the paper that in between the sort of July and October event, there was some changes in the increase in the network size. What were they focused on?
Yeah, going into the July race, of course, things like this happen where we pick a date for the event and then we engineer and research as hard as possible to get ready for that event. Going into the July event, we actually had 2 separate policies. We had one that was very fast, and we called the time trial policy, and another one that had trained how to drive around other cars, which we called the versus policy, but wasn't as fast. And so we didn't want to just have that policy all the time. And we ended up having a feature where, depending on how close cars were around the agent, it would switch between those 2 policies.
Okay.
We didn't want to be in that situation, but that's as far as we had succeeded in developing the agent. And so between July and October, we were able to train a larger network, 4 layers, 2048 nodes per layer. And that larger network was able to learn both versus and the time trial skills, and became capable of driving around other cars and still be at a superhuman individual lap time.
That's really interesting that you were able to switch between policies. And I'm in the first model, and was that obviously that's a seamless switch from one policy to another, or
it which was part of the problem. There was one instance in South where one of the cars made that switch at the wrong moment in time and ended up losing control because one policy wanted to be on the left side of the road and one wanted to be on the right side of the road. And when it switched between them, it wasn't able to accomplish the goals and spun off into the sand.
Okay. That's it. That's really interesting. And then if we were to expand, I know one of the things that was in there was pit stops. Obviously, the racetrack is kind of as you alluded to, a very controlled domain with a known set of actors that are in a sort of competitive mode. But when you come into the pit lane, there's almost a different type of environment. Obviously, the speeds are different. It's limited, but you also then have a lot of other actors pulling in or pulling into parking spaces or pulling out of parking spaces. So, do you think that would need to be again, a policy trained specifically for driving in the pit lane type environment? And then would you see that as being something that stayed as a separate policy that was switched to as it came in? Or would it be something that, again, over time would be integrated into the overall driving policy? Do you see any conflicts there?
Yeah, good question. So in general, I'd answer it as, yes, that might be a case where you train a special policy for handling pit behavior. In the case of Gran Turismo, though, the way the game is built, you drive into the pit lane, and at a certain point, an automated animation takes over, and you don't really have control of the car. It takes a fixed amount of time. You don't have to worry about interacting with other cars, and you wait 20 seconds and then you pop back out.
Yeah, okay. Interesting. We have another question that's coming from Rob again. And this is maybe talking a little bit about your choice of the neural network that you use. And he's asking, could the AI agent be built around a recurrent neural network? What would be the benefits of that? And do you think this would allow for short-term memory to be built in? And would there be benefits from that short-term memory?
It is certainly possible. We didn't find it necessary to accomplish this particular goal. If you had to drive from visions and say had to remember the cars behind you when you can't see them, then that's a scenario where having RNN or something like that could be very useful.
Okay. And are there any other sort of neural network techniques that you think could be useful for different situations that, again, weren't required for you to achieve this task, but could become part of future research or future interest? Or
one thing that I find interesting is this discussion about skills and separate policies. When you asked earlier, would you train a separate network for handling the pit? When we started, we were unsure whether using the slipstream to pass was a skill and would need its own, we'd switch to a policy to do a slipstream pass, or whether we could train a single network that was capable of driving and executing these tactical skills without them being hierarchical or layered or switching between policies. And so we don't call them skills because they're all integrated into this single policy, and it's just able to execute these tactics very effectively. But I think that's still an open question, whether you would need it for other purposes, and how you might integrate different skills if they're actually separate concepts in the agent.
Yeah, okay. And then in terms of flagging, so the use of flags in order to control race state. I noticed there was some reference to, I think, the black and white flag, which was almost like a caution before you get a penalty in the research paper. But was there any information being passed about the state of the circuit? So if there was any yellow flag zones that the vehicle needed to adhere to, or anything like that was kind of out of the normal say racing, but it puts it into a slightly different context of behavior?
That's one of the open questions. So this GT Sophy does not know about flags. It doesn't know yet about penalties and penalty zones. And so it will do things like try to pass a car in a tricky situation, even though that car has an outstanding penalty and is approaching the penalty zone where it's going to be forced to slow down by the game.
Oh, okay.
So this version of the agent is unaware of all of those external, environmental state information. But certainly, if you wanted something that could compete, at the full Nations Cup level with pit stops and appropriate behavior, around penalties and things, you would want to add those.
Yeah, and I suppose what we're moving towards, which is really exciting, and certainly for me, having been in the 16 years in Formula One and then another 5-6 years at Rover Race with autonomous racing. So kind of two separate domains, human on one side, robots on the other. But there's definitely going to be a point of convergence where in the physical domain, those two things come together and we end up with an AI agent controlling a physical car racing against a human controlling the same physical car. And I kind of, in my mind, I kind of see that as the sort of the Gary Kasparov IBM Deep Blue moment. That's when it turns into physical reality. So how far do you think we are away from achieving that? And I think your work has certainly pushed us in that direction, certainly a number of years compared to where we've been before. So,
yeah, it's a hard question. I don't like to make time predictions because they're usually
it's
wrong.
Always the challenge, yeah.
Yeah. I guess my view on one way to look at this work is it certainly sets a new bar for how good an autonomous agent can race against humans. There's a big step between doing this in Gran Turismo, which is very realistic, but there's a big difference between that and a physical car. We can crash virtual cars into the walls for 48 hours, no problem, but you can't do that with real cars to get the training data you need. And there's many things in the real world that are not yet captured in the game, and which, if you want to, even if they were, to be able to transfer the learning from the game or simulation to a real car, you have to model them very accurately, like things like tire wear, tire temperature, and the environmental effects that then affect tire temperature. All that has to be very precise to be able to operate these cars at this, at the very extremes of their traction.
Yeah, one of the things that was interesting, you showed the graph of sort of progression based on number of hours of training, and I think I saw in the paper that you finally converged after about 9 days of training. Is that right, on the optimal solution? I know it wasn't on this graph. But...
Yeah, getting from here, this 24-hour mark, we're in the top 5%, to this, just an agent that can do this, would take 8 to 14 days depending on the track. Sarth, which is about twice as long as the other two tracks, these numbers are about double, and the training times are maybe 50% longer.
Yeah, okay. And
we are getting better at that, so we're hoping we can cut that down by a fair amount, but that's what it was.
Yeah, and then when you're training, I'm just wondering how you chunk up the training, because I think I remember it didn't need to be continuous. So it didn't need to be just whole laps being driven. It could almost focus on particular, say, sections of the track and then particular scenarios for that section, and it could repeatedly train on those with random starts. Is that correct? Or?
That's right. We would, for these scenarios, we'd often run them for, I forget how long we would run each scenario, but these would be time or distance limited. So the start, if the cars got to this point, we'd cut the training off there. And if there was also a timeout in case they weren't good enough to even get that far. And all of these were individual things. We could actually train the slipstream on all 5 sections at the same time. We'd put 2 cars here, 2 cars here, 2 cars here, etc. And so, and one of the tricky things is, okay, we have these methods of collecting data, but now we have to store that data in ways where we know when we train, we're always taking some amount of samples from this scenario and these scenarios and this scenario and all of these, and balance those experiences that get pulled from the replay buffer effectively to maintain as many of these skills as possible.
It's really fascinating, because then when you start to look, and I know, so would you say that the policy that you used is different at each track? Was it specifically trained for each of those tracks?
Yeah, so far we specifically trained a policy for each of those 3 car track combinations.
Okay.
And then, but we have looked at how we can generalize across cars and tracks, and we're working on those kinds of topics.
Yeah, because then it's really fascinating when you start to look at that human equivalent of saying that, you know, there's the best Formula 1 drivers start their careers in go-karts, and there's certain fundamental skills that they're learning at that level, which then remain applicable when they move up into the Formula 1 car. But then there's some so that they kind of generalize well those skills, and then there's some that are, as you say, specific to the track or the vehicle, that then, you know, maybe don't generalize so much. So it'd be interesting to follow that work as it moves forward.
Yeah.
Oh, and what's the slide you have here on the sampling from the buffer?
Yeah, this is what we were discussing a little earlier. So this is an example of those same scenarios, and there's different configurations for all of them, and they run at a certain, you know, we have to decide how frequently all of these scenarios are trained or executed. And then we collect experiences from all those situations. And so, you know, 4 kilometers into the race, we've been on that part of the track. In this little red bar, it's that many samples from this scenario. The purple is that many samples from this scenario. And then there's also some samples from, it's probably this one. This scenario is generating examples of this section of the track. And then all that stuff gets stored into proportional tables that we use to pull experiences for training the agent.
Yeah, okay. And then we've got a question from Nicholas Chauvin on the sort of cluster and the cluster setup. But I think, to be clear, you were running on Sony's cloud-hosted PlayStations, effectively. I think it's PlayStation Now, I think it's called.
That's right.
But then in order to run the agents were running on their own separate, say, PCs, I would imagine. Is that correct?
I didn't redraw this picture, so I'm going to remove that. But
yeah.
Here's a little picture to show that. That's right. So we worked with Sony Interactive Entertainment to get access to the hardware they use for running their PlayStation Now service, which is a service that lets you play PlayStation games from your computer, where the game itself is running in the cloud on a PlayStation-like device. When humans weren't using those PlayStations in the cloud, we could set up our system so that we had rollout workers, which were basically the agent, each one playing on one of the PlayStations, and all of their experiences being pooled, like in that previous slide, and sent back to our trainer for updating our neural networks. So a typical setup would have 20 rollout workers and 20 PlayStations to train one agent.
Excellent. And then, so Nicholas's question was about training the policy on a cluster. He's picked up somewhere, it might have been 400 plus PS4s at one point. So it'd be good to get some clarity on that. And then
sure.
What was the main benefit compared to training on a single instance of the game on a single PS4? I would imagine that's the scaling that you get access to, but good if you could speak to that.
Sure. So the 400 number comes from the fact that we would set up 20 agents, but each agent could control multiple cars on the course. So in that 1v0 scenario where we were controlling all 20 cars spread equally around the course. We're basically collecting data from 400 cars at the same time. In reality, you know, there's a whole mixture of different scenarios collecting different amounts of data per PlayStation, but that's where the 400 comes from. Overall, we had access to over 1,000 PlayStations in the cloud. And so that allowed us to run multiple experiments at the same time, but none of them really exceeded the 20 or 21 PlayStations that we used for any individual agent.
Excellent. And then I'm assuming, just going back to a single instance of the game on a single PS4 would have just been incredibly restrictive in terms of the time that you could run.
Yeah. Before our project kicked off, Sony was working with some students at ETH Zurich, and they had done some early, as interns and as master students, they had done some earlier papers looking at just first time trial performance and then some example passing scenarios. And they trained their agents. They tried using one. They ended up, even without access to a big computing platform like this, they ended up having to use, I think they had 9 PlayStations crammed into their little apartments. And even that, it just makes the training take much, much longer. If you can only, it would take 20 times as long, roughly.
Yeah, and I guess that's one of the interesting things, Pete, moving from the sort of virtual domain where, as you say, you could you can crash a lot of cars and it doesn't cost you so much money, versus applying these techniques into the physical domain, and it still feels like there'd be value in trying to cross that sim to real gap. You know, you'd be better off learning as much as you can in the sort of virtual domain before entering that physical domain, and then using your experience in the physical domain to enhance the learning at that point. Is that something that you would agree with? Do you think that would be the right approach?
Yeah, I think there's definitely room to explore that. I don't think we're ready to just take an RL agent and all by itself and let it control a race car, but there's certainly ways you could explore having it be part of a larger system that helps drivers through giving advice or making, modulating some of the decisions or something like that.
Yeah, and I noticed when you were talking about, I think it was in the paper, it kind of mentioned that to train things like drafting, they're very rare events that occur, and they almost need to be scripted. You know, you almost need to deliberately create that scenario. And I think you worked with a human driver at one phase in order to create those scenarios that you could learn from, so that the human would be the staging car and create the overtaking, and the agent would still have to do the move, but it would be a human initiated training, if you like, human guided.
That's right. It was, what we did was sit down with a retired GT expert driver and say, which parts of these courses do you think are going to be really important? And what should we practice in those parts of the course? And through that, we established a set of training scenarios. And then we, so for instance, I think I showed this corner is the one where we saw the gray and green car pass the 2 humans. Mm-hmm. And so we practiced that corner on purpose in a variety of situations. We didn't have humans to practice against, but we put different kinds of opponent AIs in there, before us, behind, next to us, to the left, to the right, in front, and with random like starting speeds and things. So we varied a bunch of this initial parameters and then just let it practice this corner over and over. With those reward functions I described, it was able to learn a policy that had, you know, a variety of approaches to trying to execute a pass through that corner. And we got the information that this corner is a really good place to try to pass another car by talking to experts and playing the game.
So I think we're just about to come up to time, but I think one of the things in the future I'm really interested and excited about is to to see, something like your AI driving a physical car, but acting as the trainer for a human that's trying to race against it, to create those dynamic scenarios into these corners so that the human is building up that experience of what's it like to enter that corner and in the different lines and how would I approach it. And the AI is deliberately creating scenarios to enhance the human's learning capability and using that as a mechanism to accelerate human driver learning. Because as you say, even for any driver, some of those situations are very sparse in terms of when you're going to experience them. So artificially generating them could be a really interesting technique in the future.
Yeah, that could be very interesting.
Super. I don't know if we have any other questions from the floor. I'm looking to my colleagues at the ITU behind the scenes. Okay, if we don't, again, Pete, I'd like to thank you very much. It's been a fascinating discussion, really enjoyable, and I look forward to seeing you on a racetrack soon. Hopefully, me and you and some AIs. That will be the future I'm looking forward to. So, really appreciate your time today, and I look forward to following your future research.
Yeah, thanks for having us. It was really fun.
Excellent. Thank you, everybody out there, and have a great evening, morning, or afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you for participating in today's AI for Good session. We hope you've learned something new, innovative, and engaging in today's event. We now encourage you to continue the conversation on the live video wall in the neural network. Here you can ask questions, like and comment, share links, complete the satisfaction survey, connect with interesting profiles, or speak one-on-one using the chat and video function. After the 30-minute networking session, we invite you to explore the lobby, try the smart matching quiz, visit the virtual exhibits and poster boards, and build your personalized AI for Good program. It was a pleasure learning with you today. See you at the next AI for Good.